Among some other things, I've added a scope effect to the new heads-up display chip. And basically the meat of the effect is here, but it relies on a bunch of other stuff and boilerplate. So instead I thought it'd be interesting to see how you would make an effect like this from scratch. Alright, so let's get on with it. Rather than making you watch me write line by line, I've actually set up a few saves beforehand. So I'm just going to go through these and show you what's different. That sort of logical progression of how you go from stage to stage. And we start off in the first stage, which is a blank chip. Nothing really interesting to see here. You can set the name of it. And this is a pretty interesting way to stick a particular Starfall chip. It also works in Expression 2 as well, in a particular folder automatically. So that's kind of neat. And you can name it. You can get your initials in here if you really want to. Alright, so how do we actually draw something on screen? Well, an interesting thing to note is that you only can access the rendering functions on the client. You don't draw things on the server. So rather than being shared, server and client, I changed that line to be client. Also, I am only running this on the owner. If you want to do that, you could do something like this. I've added the first function. It's called draw. You can call it whatever you want, but it sets the color to black and draws a rectangle. Also, this is a nice shorthand. So to draw something, you have to have an active heads-up display, and you can do that with a Starfall component, or you can use this. Now, this will only work if I believe you are the owner of the chip, or if someone is sitting in a vehicle. And to actually render anything, so this will not work if I just call it the draw function. It has to be in the draw hood, not in rendering hook. So to do that, there are a few, I guess, special hooks in Starfall. There's a lot of them, but the one we're interested in is draw hood. Let's see what this one does. So yeah, 2D drawing, and the way we can add our function to run inside of the hook is first we need the name of the hook. Give it any name you want, and we give it the function. So now I'm just drawing a black box at the top left corner of the screen that is 1024 by 1024. Okay, things get a little bit more complicated as we go on to the next stage. So there's a bunch of functions involving stencils. I barely understand how stencils work, so this is going to be more of a Control-C, Control-V operation, but reset stencil, stencil set mask, stencil draw mask. And we have different rendering functions, so we have a blackout, a mask shape, and a draw scope. So what's actually going on here is I am drawing that black square from before. However, I want a circle cut out. That's what the mask shape is. So drawing a circle that we want to cut out of the square. Simple. I can't say too much about the stencil functions, but we use these later. Now, interesting is I made the stencil functions take in a different function. So that's why I have the other shape functions as functions. That sounds confusing. Anyway, so we have this other drawing function, the draw scope, and I put that in the draw hood hook instead of the old draw function. So before you can use the stencil, make sure you enable it. So set stencil enable true, and when we're done, we'll set that to false. So reset stencil, just the good practice to do that from what I've heard. And set stencil mask. So I'm actually giving the circle function to the stencil. And then stencil draw mask is, so with the circle, I guess, set as the mask, we then draw the black square and it should cut a hole out of it, like so. And you might notice the circle is very polygonal. That's just how it looks in the stencil. Now from here it gets a little more complicated, however I actually understand how this part works. So we can make this scope effect better, but In order to do so, we need to know how to use a render target or texture in Starfall. So the first thing I've done is I've given a string, and I'm saving that string to a variable called texture ID. You can call your variables whatever you want. After that, create a render target named scope effect, so using texture ID. And let's scroll down a bit. We see a couple new functions. The functions are write on texture, start texture write, and draw texture. We're gonna focus on these two first. So to draw things onto a texture, first you have to select the render target. So here we go, select render target, texture ID. I'm using render.clear, however you don't have to do that unless you want the texture to be basically its default color is going to be black. And this is kind of janky. So what I'm doing is to actually begin writing to the texture, I have a different function that adds to the render off screen hook. Render off screen will render your things without you seeing them. So I'm not sure what it looks like to write to a texture in DrawHUD, but I imagine it would just like flash at you and it would save it to a texture. Once again, you can name it whatever you want, texture maxing, and this function actually references this function. Or the way I have it set up is I call this function, it will write to the texture one time and then remove itself. Kind of sounds confusing, but to actually use your texture, so I'm not sure if I mentioned, but textures are 1024 by 1024. You can actually make them bigger or smaller when you draw something using the texture, but we'll keep it 1024 by 1024. So to draw your texture, the simplest thing to do is to draw a textured rectangle, but before that you have to set render target texture, not select. So select is only if you want to render to the texture, but set render target is how you actually select it to basically draw with its texture. Sounds really confusing. Anyway, I'm not using the draw scope function, and instead I'm using the draw texture function in the DrawHUD hook. And you can see before all of this, right after enabling my HUD, I start my texture write, which doesn't do anything but fill the texture in with black. So that's what that looks like. Yep, it's a big black square. So the clearing function, render.clear, you can change this to whatever color you want. And you can even change the opacity. So you can set it all the way to 0 alpha if you want. Now we have a framework to basically put something onto a texture and render that texture, which is gonna come in handy. So the next step is a little bit easier than the last two. We have our texture. So what are we gonna do? We are going to draw our scope effect onto said texture. So you can see I moved the draw scope function up, and all I'm doing is drawing the scope when I write to the texture. And let's actually disable this blur flare effect. So you can see there's the scope again. Has a hole cut out and everything. Now, textures, with textures, you can use something called a draw blur effect. So X, Y, repetitions, I'm not sure what repetitions does, so I normally just leave that to 1, but we can see it with a little bit of blurring. There we go. Now that's looking good. Just one more step and we'll be done. We have this texture, but it doesn't cover my monitor's screen. My monitor is 1920 by 1080. So what I've done is I've just added a couple of variables to basically store some alignment information. I'm going to move the texture into the middle of my screen. So there we go, there's our texture, there's our drawing texture function. I've added 2 more functions, full blackout, full mask. And another function, final draw, so I'm not just drawing the texture anymore. I'm doing some other things and then drawing the texture. So basically what I'm doing is I am going to draw a big black square that covers my monitor's entire resolution. So I can do that with get game resolution. And I'm drawing another mask that is in the same position and size of the texture. So basically we have a big square, a square the size of our texture making a cutout, and we're going to put our texture where that square cutout is. you can see what that looks like if I remove the draw texture. And you'll notice that this procedure looks very similar to the scope effect. We are cutting something out of another shape. So I'll show you what that looks like without drawing the texture. So now we just have a box cut out of another box. And when we draw the texture, we have our full scope effect. We have done it. And I've got a bonus for you. So if I come back down to the original mask, so this was a circle, you can set this to whatever shape you want to. So I have a very special shape. Let's see what this looks like in the scope effect. So there we go, custom shapes. However, you may notice that there's something peculiar about this shape. Let me unblur it and I think you'll be able to see it. Unblur it a little bit. Yeah, this shape is a little bit sus. The weird thing about this is I'm using rounded boxes to draw this, but I guess some shapes don't really work well in the stencil mask, or I'm doing it wrong. But yep, that is an outline of a crewmate. And that is that. Now I've actually got a request to see how the camera controller works, basically, yeah, calc view. And MFCS is probably still a ways off being done, so I'm gonna do something. I am going to put the tank up for download. And it's primarily so you can poke around MFCS so far, and you do not need to download the chips themselves. You can right click the core and it'll open up all of the other modules and things you don't have because they get included in the dupe file. So I would not recommend trying to use the chip as is, because there are almost certainly bugs and weird Starfall behavior I haven't figured out. And yeah, I guess that should be interesting to see if this works for anyone else who is curious. But that's gonna do it for this video. So, I'll see you around.